In order to clearly introduce what moral relativism says, it's going to be useful to just have a bit of terminology in hand. So a proposition, let's say, is a statement or claim about the way things are. Propositions are either true or false. We're going to call truth and falsity the two truth values. Generally speaking, a proposition can have its truth value in one of two different ways. A proposition could have its truth value relatively, or it could have its truth value objectively. A relative truth value is a truth value that is had entirely dependent on a given belief or practice. Or the way we can put it is a relative proposition is one that is true or false only relative to a specific human belief or practice. Whereas an objective proposition is one that is true or false independently of human belief and practice. These would be propositions, claims about the way the world is, that are just true or false full stop, not relative to a person or relative to a culture or relative to a practice. They just are true or just are false, regardless of what anyone thinks. Examples of relative propositions, ones that have their truth value relatively, are not hard to come by. There's, uncontroversial examples of these. So matters of taste or propositions expressing something about taste are clear-cut examples. So vanilla tastes better than chocolate. Or its sister proposition that chocolate tastes better than vanilla. This proposition clearly has its truth value relatively in the sense that whether vanilla tastes better than chocolate depends entirely on whose tastes you're talking about. So as a result, one and the same proposition might be true relative to you, but false relative to me. That is true for you and false for me. Matters are different when it comes to objective propositions. There are also some pretty uncontroversial examples of propositions that have their truth value not relatively but objectively. The proposition that the Earth orbits the sun. That one has its truth value, namely truth, full stop. It is simply the case that it is true that the Earth orbits the sun. It's not that the Earth orbits the sun relative to you, but not relative to me, or that the Earth orbits the sun relative to one culture, but not relative to another. Now, it is, of course, true that at different points through human history, different groups of people, different societies have believed that this proposition is false. That, of course, is true. The idea, though, is that we can recognize that sometimes human beliefs get the propositions wrong, get the truth of things just incorrect. And that occurs when you have an objectively true or false proposition that is being believed. There's the possibility of genuine error there. By contrast, there's no possibility of genuine error with respect to whether vanilla tastes better than chocolate. It's not like one day the scientists are going to announce that, oh, in fact, we've discovered that the proposition chocolate tastes better than vanilla was the objectively true one all along. All of the vanilla lovers weep, they were wrong and need to be converted. That's never going to happen. Why? Because the nature of the subject here is an intrinsically relative one as opposed to an intrinsically objective one. Moral propositions are claims about what's right and wrong, about what is good and bad, virtuous or vicious. And here are a few examples of moral propositions. It's morally permissible to eat meat. Here's another one. It's morally wrong to eat humans. Here's another one. Abortion is sometimes morally right. Yet another one. Infanticide is always immoral. Now, regardless of where you stand on the truth or falsity of any given one of these, you can see that each of them concern something about what is right or wrong. about what is permitted or what is forbidden in a distinctively moral sense. Moral relativism we can understand as the view that moral propositions are relatively true or false. It makes no sense, according to moral relativism, to ask whether the proposition that it's morally permissible to eat meat is objectively true or not. Instead, you have to specify, well, for whom? I mean, for you, it might be true that it is morally permissible to eat meat, but for me, it might be false. Likewise, it might be morally right for one culture to eat humans and morally wrong for another culture to eat humans. That is, this proposition might be true for them, but false for us, say. Moral objectivism, by contrast, is the view that moral propositions are objectively true or false. That is, they are more like the case of the proposition that the Earth orbits the sun, not in that they can be tested scientifically, but instead in that whether they are true or false is not something that you have to specify a for whom. You don't have to say, well, it's permissible for you, but not for me. Instead, it's either morally permissible, full stop, to eat meat or not. That is the debate between moral relativism and moral objectivism. Since moral relativism says that moral propositions are only relatively true or false, and for a proposition to be relatively true or false is for it to have its truth value relative to a given set of human beliefs or practices, we can specify which level of human beliefs and practices we're talking about, and then get different versions of relativism as a result. So the most radical version of relativism would say that that moral propositions are true or false depending on each individual belief. One and the same proposition, moral proposition about, say, abortion might be true for you but false for me. The more popular version of relativism is cultural relativism, which specifies cultural level beliefs and practices as opposed to individual beliefs and practices, and says that moral propositions are true or false only relative to a given culture's beliefs and practices. The question is, why should we believe moral relativism? And we're going to look at a version of one of the most popular arguments for cultural relativism, an argument from cultural difference or cultural disagreement, in just a second. Perhaps the main argument for cultural relativism begins with the observation that there are a wide variety of differences between cultures regarding certain moral propositions. The way we'll put this is that there are cultural differences regarding morality. Now, sometimes this is at the level of conscious beliefs. You could characterize it as a disagreement between two cultures regarding one and the same moral proposition. Other times, it's more complicated because the proposition may or may not enter consciously into the individual's moral code. It could instead be what is broadly practiced and whether or not it's thought of morally or not. Two really vivid examples of cultural differences regarding morality that we get from your reading, the James Rachel's reading. One is this ancient story from an ancient author on the meeting of the Greeks and the Galatians and their mutual disgust at one another's burial practices. So the Greeks meet the Galatians, and what they learn is that the way the Galatians bury their dead is in part by ritually consuming their flesh. Cannibalism is an integrated part of the Galatian burial practice. The Greeks, of course, are horrified not just in the sense of disgust, but they also have a moral weight to their disgust. I mean, they see this as a deeply disrespectful thing to do to one's dead, especially one's dead relatives, to literally eat them. The Galatians, though, interestingly, have precisely the same moral reaction of disgust when they learn the way the Greeks treated their dead. The Greeks did not consume their dead, they burned them on a pyre. Now, the Galatians learn about this, and they are horrified. They say to themselves, you do what to your father who's just died? You burn his body like he's, trash? I mean, that is the most disrespectful thing one can imagine, so they think. If you're going to be respectful, the thing to do is to consume the offering of this person's nutritious flesh that they've offered to you. To turn that down and to burn them is the most horrifying of sins, according to the Galatians. So here, the proposition, one should consume one's dead, is regarded as true by the Greeks and regarded as true by the Galatians and regarded as false by the Greeks. So there's a clear-cut case of a cultural difference or disagreement regarding a moral proposition. A more recent example, and the sort of example that I think has inspired many anthropologists and sociologists to adopt either methodologically or philosophically cultural relativism, is this example of the Inuit practice of infanticide. Explorers in the early 1900s, this is sort of the beginning of modern sociology and modern anthropology, are exploring up into northern Canada, and they encounter groups of native Inuit peoples who had some, to them, very shocking practices of regularly and without any moral blame, sacrificing, so to speak, one of their children. Usually it was an infant, and the sacrifice wasn't a religious sacrifice, but instead it was a sacrifice for the sake of the safety of the group, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Mothers would sometimes, especially mothers that had 3, 4, or 5 children, if they had another baby, this was disproportionately gendered, so it was more often than not female infants, but not exclusively. They were wrapped in leaves and then left out in the snow to perish. We, of course, Americans today in the 21st century, we have laws against infanticide. We think of it morally as a form of murder, and so we say it's morally wrong. So the proposition infanticide is wrong. We regard that proposition as true. The Inuits regarded it as false. What you have there is a disagreement or difference regarding a moral proposition. And it is cases like these that have inspired both philosophers but also sociologists and anthropologists to sort of throw up their hands and conclude, well, this shows that moral propositions can only be true or false relative to a specific culture. The proposition that it's wrong to eat the dead is true for the Greeks, but false for the Galatians. The proposition that it is morally permissible to do infanticide is true for the Inuits, but false for us. So here are a couple of early figures who give expression to something like this argument. Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist in 1932, says this: "We recognize that morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. Mankind has always preferred to say it is morally good rather than it is habitual. But historically, the two phrases are synonymous. The concept of the moral is properly a variant of the concept of the good. It is that which society has approved. A normal action is one which falls well within the limits of expected behavior." Then we have the sociologist William Sumner in 1906 says this: "The right way is the way which the ancestors used and which has been handed down. The tradition is its own warrant. The notion of right is in the folk ways. It is not outside of them, of independent origin, and brought to test them. In the folk ways, whatever it is right. This is because they are traditional, and therefore contain in themselves the authority of the ancestral ghosts." The cultural differences argument begins with the following, what seems to be pretty uncontroversial observation, that there are cultural differences regarding moral propositions. I mean, we just saw 2 examples, right? The Galatians and the Greeks have differences regarding the proposition that it's permissible to eat the dead. The Americans and the Inuits have this disagreement regarding the proposition that it is morally permissible to sometimes kill one's infants. The simplest version of this argument, and this is the version that James Rachels works with, just has the single premise: there are these differences regarding moral propositions, and concludes straightforwardly from that, therefore cultural relativism is true, or therefore moral propositions are true or false only relative to a given culture. Rachel rightly says that if that is the version of the argument, it is simply logically invalid. That is, the conclusion that the truth value of moral propositions is had only relative to a given culture simply does not logically follow as a matter of necessity from the claim that there are these differences. All we need to do is to think of another possible explanation or another possible scenario in which there are these cultural differences, but in which cultural relativism is false. And it's easy to see that, well, it could simply be that regarding these moral propositions, one culture is incorrect or has incorrect beliefs in the same way that other objective propositions have their truth value objectively, but there's not always unanimous agreement about what that truth value is. I think that if we're being a little more charitable, we should supply an additional premise to the cultural relativist. It's easy, once you know a bit of baby logic, to make an invalid argument valid. So I don't see why we can't just add, there are cultural differences regarding moral propositions, another premise that says any proposition about which there are cultural differences is true or false relative to culture. If we supply this additional premise, now we have a valid argument, because now what we have is there are cultural differences regarding moral propositions. A second claim, which is a general principle that says whenever you have a proposition about which there are two cultures that disagree, that proposition can have its truth value only relative to a culture, from which, yes, it does follow that moral propositions are true or false only relative to culture, or cultural relativism is true. That is, if these two premises are true, then that conclusion is true. Now, in a way, like, what we've done is just shift the locus of controversy a little bit, because, you know, this first premise is definitely true, although we will revisit the details in a second. And now what we'll need is, well, why should we believe this second premise? Why think that any proposition about which there are cultural differences is one that has its truth value only relatively? And this one, the way we can think about it is that what Rachels provides as a reason to think that the original version with one premise is invalid is for us really a counterexample to premise two. Consider a different matter. In some societies, people believe the earth is flat. In other societies, such as our own, people believe the earth is roughly spherical. Does it follow from the mere fact that people disagree that there is no objective truth in geography? Of course not. We would never draw such a conclusion because we realize that in their beliefs about the world, the members of some societies might simply be wrong. So the cultural disagreement regarding geography or the shape of the earth is real, and nevertheless, no one is inclined to throw up their hands and say, well, I guess the proposition that the earth is flat just has a relative truth value, you know, true for them, false for us, or whatever. No, there's a fact of the matter, and the fact of the matter is that the earth is not flat, even though there are cultures and societies, both now and historically, who thought otherwise. They were simply wrong. So this is a counterexample to the second premise. The discussion should not end there. I will just flag this. This is a very simplistic version of the argument from cultural differences for relativism. These days, defenders of relativism will swap out the second premise for a more sophisticated principle. And
it's worth thinking a little bit to get in the mindset of maybe you can come up with a better principle that isn't susceptible to this kind of counterexample. What are some features that moral propositions and the disagreements about them have in common that mark them out from the geography example? Is there any relevant difference between disagreements regarding geography and disagreements regarding morality? I mean, one idea that relativists have thrown out there is that moral disagreements seem to be rationally irresolvable in a way that geography disagreements are not. That is, if you get everybody on the same page, you give them the same math, and they're all thinking clearly, eventually everyone will come around to see, oh, the earth is in fact round. Not so when it comes to whether abortion is immoral or not. You give everybody the same data, the same math, the same empirical facts, and you get them all to calm down, they're still going to disagree about the morality. Not so regarding burial practices. The same goes there. So relativists have maybe suggested that maybe the difference is whether the disagreements can be resolved or not. What you would then need would be to swap out premise 2 for a principle that says any proposition about which there are rationally irresolvable disagreements is true or false relative to culture. And then the first premise would need to say there are rationally irresolvable cultural differences regarding moral propositions. I leave that to you to think about. That's one of the questions in the discussion thread. Are there differences between the geography case and the moral case? And do those differences to you suggest that perhaps we should be relativists about one, even if we're objectivists about the other?
So Rachel rejects the second premise of the argument pretty definitively. There's a really interesting bit of the piece in which Rachel suggests that even the first premise of the argument that says there are these cultural disagreements regarding morality may be a little misleading. He doesn't quite say it's false, but I think his suggestion is we shouldn't overestimate the depth and degree of moral disagreements across cultures. Yes, there are different practices, but he thinks that even in the most apparently radically opposed cases, like we have the American moral code saying infanticide is wrong and the Inuit moral code saying it can be permissible, he thinks it's really important for us to pause and ask ourselves, why? Why are these different moral codes in place? He thinks that when we ask that why question, pretty quickly what we'll discover in many, though maybe not all cases of moral disagreement, is that the reasons why, for example, the Inuits think that infanticide is permissible turns out to be more morally comprehensible to us than it initially seems. So empirically, there is some debate about exactly what the reasons for this practice were in the Inuit culture. However, there is also widespread agreement among those who are interviewing the mothers who either did this or knew mothers who did it at the time, and who asked them for their reasons. There is agreement that obviously the reason for the infanticide practice was not that, oh, well, Inuit people, unlike Americans, hate their children. That obviously is not the explanation. They are humans just like us. There has to be some other reason for why this practice would become embedded in their culture. And sure enough, when you look into the details, it turns out that one possible explanation that certainly some of the mothers gave when they were interviewed was for the sake of the survival, the literal survival of the rest of their families. So you have to keep in mind that the Inuit peoples were, or these particular tribes were nomadic. They carried all of their belongings on their backs. They trudged through long winters to find new places to set up their homes. And usually the group trudging through the snow for weeks on end was composed mostly of women. The women were the ones who had to carry their homes were like collapsible and they could put them on their backs and carry a sled behind them. They were the ones who stayed with their little children and walked through the snow while the men were off
hunting for food and bringing back food to the group trudging through the snow for weeks on end. As you can imagine, a woman with 4, 5, 6 little children is going to quickly have a lot of trouble carrying and keeping up with this load of belongings that she has with her. And part of the issue was, my understanding is that part of the issue was that if a family fell behind the larger group typically couldn't afford to stay behind and slow down. They had to move before colder weather came in, or they would all die. And as a result, if you are one of these women who has 5 children and you're already having trouble keeping up with the group, and you're pregnant, and then you give birth and you have yet another little one, this time you have to hold that baby in one of your arms in order to feed it, in order to, it can't walk, in order to bring it along, but none of your arms are free. So at that point you have a decision to make. If I try to keep all 6 of my children with me, almost certainly we as a group will fall behind and all perish. That is the consequence of having that 6th child and keeping it. The other option for many of these women was abandon the tiny baby that was just born. Now, that decision, you can imagine, was a horrifically painful one. Here is what ethnographer reports about this. What were the reason for the Netsilik, this was one of the groups that practiced this, killing such a large proportion of their infants? It was evidently not simple callousness. Of course not, since the children allowed to live were dearly loved and cared for. Analysis of case material together with informant statements indicate that survival reasons in an extremely harsh environment are to be found behind this practice. The practice was an adaptive one, for it increased the chances of survival of the community by reducing the number of non-food procuring people to be fed. So here, the suggestion is, when we look at the reasons for this practice, what we find is a kind of moral dilemma that these mothers faced. The choice they faced was one that we fortunately, now and through most of our history, never ever have to face. And that decision was, shall I try to carry this infant knowing that all of us, me and the other children I already have, will fall behind and freeze to death? That is, will I let all 6 of us die? Or will I kill one of us? Those were, in stark terms, sometimes the only 2 options that these mothers were presented with. And so this is how, according to Rachel's, one and the same shared moral values, like children are valuable and to be loved, they of course had precisely those values. How is it that they could give, it could come about that they had this different practice of sometimes killing one of their children if they shared this value? Well, the answer is they found themselves in moral dilemma circumstances. We, on the other hand, typically, fortunately, because we're not nomadic, because our environments aren't harsh, because of our economic prosperity, very rarely do we ever find ourselves in that circumstance. And the question to ask yourself is, if you were in that circumstance, is it inconceivable to you that you might make a similar choice as one of the Inuit mothers? Or if someone you knew was put in that circumstance and they made that choice, would you necessarily judge them morally in the way that you might judge somebody who killed their infant for no reason at all? Those morally seem like very different circumstances. And Rachel's thinks, yes, these are differences in practices, but they mask, if we don't ask why the practices exist, this underlying shared value. The thing that we're going to be discussing in the next video will be taking on the question of moral dilemmas directly. And I'll be asking you to put yourself in a hypothetical situation. These are the trolley problems. And consider what you would do if forced to choose between a certain number of lives.